Good morning, Tom here with Grand Custom Cabinets, and today we're going to talk a little bit about sanding. Now, sanding is the job that everybody hates, but it's a very important part to the cabinet finishing process or any wood product. So basically, first we need to understand what we're trying to do with sanding. And the bottom line is we're trying to leave a series of scratches on the finish of this wood that are so small they cannot be seen with the naked eye. The other thing that sanding does for us is it opens up the grain of the wood for uniform porosity. That's very important for a stain finish. The stain color is highly affected by the porosity of the wood. So you have two basic surfaces that you're going to be dealing with in sanding: solid wood and veneer. So we'll talk about solid wood first. So this piece of wood here, the space frame, this is what we refer to as a machined surface. This wood has been run through a planer, taken from 13/16 down to 3/4. So this exact uniform thickness, which makes our frames very neat and tidy. And so the actual surface of this wood is microscopic hills and valleys from the cutting action of the planer. There also will be some pressure marks, because as a cutter cuts wood, it tends to lift wood in some spots and compress it in others. Again, varying porosity. So the sanding process is going to uniform up that surface. Now, in the case of machine marks, where we start with 120 grit. We've found that that's a good balance between not risking leaving too deep of scratches, yet still effective fast cutting to eliminate those machine marks so that we can proceed through our grit sequence. Now, an important thing to understand is that sanders are not created all alike. For our rough grit, for our 120, we use a sander that has a 3/16 orbit. It's an aggressive sander, it removes a lot of material. The Porter cable here, this one basically requires two hands to operate, so this is only used on face frames after they're nailed to a cabinet. If you want to do your initial rough sanding on something that's free and floating around the bench, I highly suggest using a sander that can be controlled with one hand. And again, the orbit diameter is very important to be matched to your grit that's on that machine. So we sand with 120. Now, an important concept here is dwell time, okay? The longer a soft pad sander sits on a work surface, the greater the likelihood that it's going to start dishing it and rounding it over. So as you're sanding, you're basically just doing one or two little passes in each spot, and then you're moving forward. Do not dwell on that piece. To run this frame with 120 should probably only take like maybe 1 minute and 30 seconds, if that. Next, we then proceed to the 150 grit. Now, the important thing here is the 150 grit sander is a 3/32 orbit. If you try to use 150 on your aggressive orbit sander, you're going to have a lot of issues with cross-grain scratches, and that a lot of times you don't see that until you put the finish on, and then you're kind of in a pickle. So then we sand with the 150. That sanding process is even faster, even less dwell time on the wood, because all we're doing with the 150 is cutting down the deeper scratches left by the 120. Now, what we like to do is after our 150 sand, any routing that needs to be done to the frame is then performed at this time. The reason why is if you route before you rough sand, your rough sand can actually change that profile slightly, because you are removing somewhat of a visible amount of material from the frame. The other reason is any pressure marks or scratches left by the routing can then be cleaned up in our final sand. For our final sand, we like to use the Dyne Braid. It's a 3/32 orbital sander. It's very ergonomic. You can control this thing. It's nice and light. That's very important so that You don't dwell in certain spots, hang up on things. Now, this sand is basically, the sander's just on, and it's just moved around the workpiece. And that's about all it takes to get your final scratch with the 180. So that's how we deal with a solid wood machined surface. Now we'll talk about door sanding. This is one of the largest labor expenses in doors, is the actual sanding of them. Now after we glue up doors out of our 13/16 stock, they're then run through this wide belt here behind me, and they are dimensionally sanded. Dimensional sanding uses a hard platen. It's also known as abrasive machining. So there's no dishes. The hardness of the wood varying in different spots does not affect the levelness of the sanding surface because there's a platen that controls it. So first we run through with 120. That's our aggressive material removal step. We remove approximately 0.08 of an inch per pass at 120. Then after the doors have all been uniformly machined to where there's no uneven spots left, and in the case of flush inset, they have to match your frame thickness exactly. So in that case, we have to take them down to 0.750. Then we put a 180 grit belt into the wide belt and run the doors through one pass per side at 180 grit. That cleans up the scratches left by the 120 grit. Then we have very fine cross-grain scratches here on the rails of our doors. The 180 grit that's parallel to the grain is almost a finishable surface. So then what we're going to do is we're actually going to drop back down a grit. And our first initial finish sand on the door is going to be done with 150 grit on a 3/32 orbital sander. It does not take much to remove those 180 grit cross-grain scratches. Again, basically just a few back and forth as you're working around your frame. That's all it takes. To run through the grit sequence on a door should only take you about 3 minutes a door. That's my average time. Now, after we've run the 150 grit, again, back to the routing thing. In between the 150 and the 180, we do any outside edge machining we want to do to the doors. That's basically a hand routing operation. So in the case of like a shaker style door, we're going to run our 1/16 of an inch breaker bit all the way around the perimeter of the door. Then we're going to sand the door with our 180, our finished step. Another really important thing here, I don't know if you've noticed, but as I'm picking this up, I'm habitually wiping it like this. You set your sander down the bench, little bits of hardwood or whatever can get on the pad. And that can cause a lot of issues with scratches and pressure marks because that little piece is sitting there getting rolled around like a ball bearing underneath the sander pad. So very important to make sure that your sanding pad is clean. Then we run through our 180 grit, and that leaves a fine enough scratch pattern to where the door is now ready for finishing. The final step dealing with doors is occasionally some stuff has to be hand sanded. So a prime example of that is a shaker style door has a very sharp inside edge. So what can happen is that edge is sharp enough to kind of cut somebody or give somebody a splinter. And also what tends to happen is the surface tension of the finish tends to pull it away from that edge. And so you don't get good coverage. That's especially noticeable with a solid color finish. That edge will be not, like all white like everything else on the door. So to deal with that, we do what we call micro beveling. Very important to use a block when you do this. Don't do it with just your fingers and a piece of sandpaper. It doesn't leave a good enough cut, plus you risk getting a nice splinter right in the tip of your finger. So we simply run this block down this edge, 120 grit on the block, gentle pressure. That's all it takes to cut that edge and create a little 45-degree micro bevel. Now, the next thing that you commonly have to sand is veneer plywood. So I would swear to you, these guys have contests to see how thin they can get these veneers. And I think there's an award that's handed out at like the National Plywood Manufacturers Association convention. So what we have found works well for us on veneer plywood, whatever you do, 120 grit sandpaper and veneer plywood do not mix. Don't do it. So commonly we have some nail holes. They've been putty. And so what we do when we're sanding, like say for example, the finished end on a cabinet that's veneer plywood, we start with the 150 grit. And we focus primarily on cutting down our leftover putty from the holes. As soon as that putty has been cut flush to the surface, you stop sanding that area. But what we do in order to have a consistent finish, you still have to run that 150 sander over the entire surface. Then the veneer plywood is finished up with the 180 finish sand and leaves a nice smooth finish. So sanding, again, everybody's least favorite job. It creates a lot of dust. Talk a little bit about dust control here. So nobody really likes having to wear a mask all day long. So what we've done is to try and make it so that there's not very many situations where I actually have to wear a mask for 4 to 6 hours at a time. So what I found is that most of your dust is actually simply going to just fall down below the door. So this is the top we had to our old downdraft sanding table. So most of the dust from sanding these doors just kind of falls down to here. I like to use what I call cross flow ventilation now. We have an air filter there, we turn that guy on, and any super fine dust that's thrown out by the sanders as you're sanding basically gets caught up in that airstream and pulled into that filter. So that helps minimize airborne superfine dust all around the shop. Best way I know to test your dust control setup on sanding is just, sand some doors and then go to the bathroom and blow your nose. That'll tell you everything you need to know. So that's kind of a basic primer on sanding, and I hope that helps you guys out.